Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at how to create this amazing Egyptian inspired 3D display inside of Photoshop. What I want to do is to start off with looking at the setup that we've got here. We're going to be working with two shapes and we're going to be looking at how to use shapes inside of Photoshop 3D. So we've got one shape which I'm calling the bridge, and I've given it the name bridge. Another one I'm calling Horus. The shape called Horus is basically the eye of Horus from ancient Egyptian mythology and ancient Egyptian arithmetic as well. And then we've got a wall or background which I've got right at the top there, and I've given that the name wall. I've got my 3D workspace open, and we're going to jump in and look at how to actually do something amazing with this. So for the bridge shape, I've basically created a shape which is going to go between two elements of the eye and given it a kind of rainbow gradient. We're going to start off by creating 3D extrusions. So we start off with the bridge. We go to 3D extrusion, or you can go to 3D in the menu and choose new 3D extrusion from path or layer. I'm going to go to the 3D panel. We'll choose create extrusion, and then we'll go to the eye of Horus, turn that on and create another extrusion. And the third one is going to be a postcard. So we'll choose postcard, hit create, and away we go. Now I've done 2 or 3 3D videos quite recently, and I'm not going to go into too much detail in this particular video. You can look at those if you need to catch up on some of the techniques. I've selected all 3 items in the layers panel, and we're going to just collapse them to make things a little bit easier to work with. And then we'll go to the 3D menu and choose merge 3D layers. Awesome. Now I'm just going to move the current view around so that the current view is below the viewport, so that this line here and the grid is below the viewport. And we'll just increase the size of that. Now for the bridge and the eye of Horus, these are two different shapes, and I could select both of them and then move them around. But when it comes to scaling them, it'll be a lot better to actually group them together. So I'm going to right click these two, hit group objects, and we're going to call the group main. And we can now move the main group around rather than the individual shapes. The next thing I want to do is to just do a very quick render. So we'll hit tab, go to 3D, render 3D layer. So you can see we've got a lot of work to do. Let's hit tab, and the first thing I'm going to do is to work on the wall. I want to go and work on the materials. The materials have a diffuse texture which is created by Photoshop, and they also have an opacity material, again created by Photoshop. Let's get rid of the diffuse material and remove the texture there. Everything goes blank, but we'll remove the opacity texture and it comes back. Now I've got an idea we need to create a fairly dark background, so we'll change the diffuse color to a hue of 0, saturation of 0, brightness of 21. And I'm basically going to be working with a lot of grays, so the only thing that changes is the brightness value. So we'll go for a brightness of around 20 for the diffuse. The specular is going to have a brightness of around 25 or 28. I'm going to change the ambient and make that a light kind of magenta color, and we'll leave everything else for the time being. Next, I'm going to go to the main group, and we are going to look at the materials for the bridge. Now, the material for the bridge is basically the kind of bright rainbow that we originally started with. And if I move the bridge out like this, you can see that bright rainbow color. So I'm just going to position this so that it's kind of visible in the light, and just move it slightly so it's well positioned between the two parts of the eye. The next thing I want to do is to work with the shape of the eye. And before doing that, we'll go to the environment. If you click on the light tab, you'll see that we've already got a light, which is the infinite light. And I'm just going to move this down like that so that this default infinite light is kind of pointing into the design and we can see what's going on. There's also an environment light, and I might as well just make that a little bit brighter and take the shadows and make them really soft. I'm going to change the global ambient color, and again just make it that kind of magenta, bright magenta color. And you can see it changes the colors inside the image. We will now go and work with maybe the shapes. So let's go and go to the main, we'll choose bridge, go to the properties panel, and I'm going to change the extrusion depth to 250. And again, we'll go to the eye of Horus and change the extrusion depth there to 250. Now what I want you to see is that if we bring this panel out, because I've changed everything to 250, in this particular design, everything is now lining up at this cross point here, which is right at the center of the design. So what that means is that everything should be more or less lined up against the back wall, which is right at that point there. And in actual fact, I'll go to the main and just move it a little bit forward so there's a tiny gap between that, just a tiny gap there, and that's gonna produce more interesting shadows, I think. We'll swap these around, and I'm going to work on the lights. We'll go to the lights tab, and I'll go to the properties and choose infinite light. And what I'm going to do is to open up a preset that I created. The preset is going to add 3 point lights to the display, to the design. And if I zoom out, you can see the 3 point lights. To create a point light, just go down here and choose new point light. With these three, they've all got very similar values. They've got an intensity of around 90, between 50 and 90%. Softness around 80 to 100. This one has a softness of 100, intensity of 54. And this one is at 47% and softness of 83. And what I've done is just, if I select all three of them, I've positioned them so that they are fairly close to the wall and just giving us some interesting shadows, as you can see there. So just move these around and change the settings until you get some interesting shadows. I'm going to reset these. And I just want to go to the infinite light. I'll show you that the infinite light is more or less as it was when I first edited it. We can now do a very quick render maybe and see what that looks like. So you can see that's coming out okay. We've got some interesting shadows, and that's really what the point lights are there for, to create some interesting shadows and give the design some depth. What I want to do now is to work with the shapes and the material. The first thing is to go to the eye of Horus. I want to get rid of this gap in between the eyes, this gap up here, and also the gap down here. Now, you might see that as I'm hovering over these gaps, it's kind of lighting up with a blue outline. I'm just going to zoom in. And that blue outline is basically when I'm highlighting what's known as a constraint. So let's just get rid of these constraints, or let's just change the settings. I'm going to click on the blue line. That will select that gap right at the top. We're going to go to the properties and change the setting to inactive. And that gets rid of that little gap. We'll go to here, do the same, and we'll go down to here and do the same. Now, why are the colors all kind of different? Let's go and work with the materials. And this is going to be the major part of the final part of the design. We're going to go to the Eye of Horus, choose all 5 materials and just delete the texture. So it creates a texture, and sometimes those textures are good. It's automatically created by the computer. Sometimes you want it, sometimes you don't want it. I've just removed all of them. I'm going to actually call up some textures I created earlier. Now, if you click here, you'll find that you've got default materials, and I've created a few which I'm going to select now. So for the front, I'm going to create a blue which goes well with this sort of design, and the diffuse setting is going to be a hue of 265, which is kind of purple, saturation 91, brightness 7. The specular for the front is going to be 220, 1729. And shine is going to be 33, reflection 17. We're going to go to the bevel material, and I'm going to choose a kind of gold color. You can use the built-in gold materials. My one has a hue of 45, saturation 50, brightness 25. For the diffuse, for the specular, 45, 65, 65. Now you can't see it, but we'll change that by going to the shape, choosing the cap, and I'm just going to increase the bevel. So you can now see that little bevel coming out, nice and golden. We'll go down to the extrusion material. This is an important one, and we're going to again choose something I've created already. This has a diffuse of gray of 19%, a specular of a gray of 31%, and we've got the ambient set to white. I'm actually going to change that and make that a little bit purple, a little bit magenta, bright magenta. The shine is at 80 and the reflection is at 47%. Everything else is at default. And what that does basically is that it creates this kind of shininess inside of the shape. And it's not something that you're going to see when we do the render, but it's just going to give a hint of depth right inside there. So for the back materials, we'll just, for the back bevel and the back inflation, it's not really important, but I'm going to use the same. I'm going to use the same materials for those two as for the extrusion. We can now do a very quick render, see what that looks like. One last thing, I'm going to just puff out the surface of the eye, and to do that we'll go to the Eye of Horus, we'll choose the cap tab, and what we want to do, we can either work here, let's work here for a change. I'm just going to increase the front inflation strength so it's around 1 or 2, and then we'll change the angle here so that it's around 14, 15. That just gives everything a nice tiny bulge, and we'll create some interesting reflections there. I think everything is good. We'll now hit the tab key, zoom into 100, and we'll do the full render, and I'll come back once that's done. So that is it there. I think it looks pretty good, pretty easy to do. So hopefully you found some of that useful. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe, share the video, leave a comment, all of that good stuff. I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.